October 14, 1943, 27,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The air was a silent, biting void, a sapphire canvas fractured by the white contrails of 1,000 aircraft. Below, the factories that fed the Nazi war machine waited, utterly unaware of the storm descending upon them. High above, inside the pressurized coffin of a Boeing B-17 flying fortress, Sergeant Robert Bob Hansen, a boy barely old enough to vote, was paralyzed by the cold and the responsibility. His world was reduced to a narrow plexiglass cone, the twin barrels of his M2 Brownings, and the ceaseless deafening roar of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines, a sound like distant mechanical thunder. He was the tail-end Charlie, the last solitary sentry of the bomber formation. In the lexicon of the German Luftwaffe, they called the B-17 the Fliegende Festung, the flying fortress. To the Allied airmen, it was a promise of survival, bristling with 13 heavy machine guns. But to the German fighter pilots, those guns were initially seen less as a threat and more as a desperate, inaccurate gesture. When the B-17 first appeared in the skies of 1942, many Axis aces laughed. It was a lumbering behemoth, slow, predictable, and seemingly too large to be an effective weapon of war. Herein lay the great and bloody irony of the daylight bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe's early contempt for the B-17 would ultimately become the very flaw that led to their own demise. The prevailing German doctrine, forged in the Blitzkrieg and the Battle of Britain, centered on speed and decisive vertical attack. They were masters of the high-speed pass, the head-on engagement, or the classic dive from above. But the very existence of the B-17 forced a painful strategic readjustment. The bomber's formidable forward armament, the twin chin turret guns, made a frontal attack a near-suicidal proposition. Attacks from the top were complicated by the ball turret and the dorsal turret. The enemy's gaze began to shift to the most vulnerable and seemingly less defended quadrant, the rear. The B-17 was ugly, but it had a beauty in its defensive concept, recalled Chief Engineer Walter Higgins in a post-war interview. We knew the fighter could come from anywhere, but the tail was always the blind spot for the pilot. We had to put our toughest, sharpest kid back there, giving him the longest reach. The tail gunner was that reach. Sitting in a cramped compartment, often freezing and suffering from oxygen deprivation, his was the most terrifying job. He was alone, isolated, and the first to see the enemy coming in a direct line of fire. His survival depended entirely on his vigilance and the 2 heavy machine guns under his control, firing $0, $50 caliber rounds at a cyclic rate of 750 rounds per minute. Today, as the massive armada approached the target, the German fighters finally came. Not in the small probing attacks of previous months, but in a coordinated, terrifying swarm. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s appeared on the horizon like a dark plague, their engines screaming. The sky quickly transformed into a lethal geometry of vapor trails, tracers, and exploding flak, a scene of organized industrial death. The German pilots knew their best chance was to break the cohesion of the bomber stream, and to do that, they had to destroy the tail-end Charlie first. One of the most decorated German aces of the time, Major Erich Stahl, known for his cold efficiency, once wrote in his operational log, "The American bomber, it is a sturdy beast. But its weakness is obvious, the human element at the rear. Isolate the last aircraft, confuse the gunner and the formation folds. It is a mathematical certainty." But what Major Stahl and the German High Command failed to fully calculate was the unpredictable variable of human fear, adrenaline, and desperate training. They saw a machine. The gunners saw the horizon rapidly shrinking to a pair of terrifying cannon muzzles, forcing them to become something more than just a soldier, a hunter waiting in the corner of the kill box. As the first wave of FW-190s peeled off for a high-speed pass directly at Hansen's B-17, the very air around him began to tremble. This was not a training exercise. This was the moment the fortress would live up to its name, or become a blazing funeral pyre, a tiny piece of debris falling thousands of feet to the uncaring German soil below. The greatest battles in history are often decided by the smallest details. A single, focused man in the belly of a beast, ready to fight against impossible odds. The Luftwaffe had underestimated the B-17. and in doing so had created the legend of the tail gunner. If the terrifying dance between the Flying Fortress and the Luftwaffe has you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe. We dive into the unseen stories of World War II every week. The initial salvos of the Schweinfurt raid were a violent proving ground for the B-17's design philosophy. The mission was a calculated risk, a deep penetration into enemy airspace without effective long-range fighter escort. The fate of the mission, and indeed the future of daylight precision bombing, rested on the ability of the formation's combined defensive fire to repel the elite German fighters. The Luftwaffe, having learned the cost of frontal attacks, adopted the rear quarter and, more terrifyingly, the slightly below rear quarter attack. This angle, the 6 o'clock low, was difficult for the tail gunner to track and put the fighter out of the line of fire of the dorsal and ball turrets for precious seconds. Sergeant Hansen, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, finally saw his targets, a tight pair of FW-190s, their radial engines glowing and their $20 Extol cannon muzzles spitting fire. The German tactic was simple: concentrate fire on one aircraft to guarantee a kill, then peel off. You don't aim at the plane, a seasoned veteran had once told Hansen. You aim at the future of the plane. The technology of the B-17 gunnery was deceptively simple, but incredibly lethal. The $50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun was the undisputed champion of heavy air-to-air armament. Its high muzzle velocity and kinetic energy meant that a single burst could rip engine blocks apart, sever control cables, or detonate hydraulic lines. Crucially, the ammunition belts carried a lethal mix: armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds, creating a devastating cocktail of destruction upon impact. We understood the kinetic energy of that $50 caliber bullet, explained Herr Dr. Klaus Richter, a German aeronautical engineer captured later in the war. Our fighters were fast, yes, but speed required lightness. Lightness meant our armor was thin, especially around the wing roots and fuel tanks. The American $50 caliber did not just puncture, it destroyed. It tore large, ragged holes and ignited everything inside. We were trying to swat a wasp with a fly swatter. The sheer scale of the armament was staggering. A fully loaded B-17 carried over 8,000 rounds of ammunition. If every gunner fired simultaneously, the fortress could put out a combined rate of fire exceeding 9,000 rounds per minute. A veritable storm of metal designed to create a firewall the enemy dared not cross. Yet this defensive strength was tested daily by the sheer determination of the Luftwaffe pilots. Hauptmann Dieter Lorenz, flying a heavily armed Bf-109 G6, approached the tail of Hansen's formation, focused on the bomber known as the Lady Luck. "There is no time for fear in that moment," Lorenz recalled in his journal. "There is only the sight picture, the speed calculation, the closure rate. You must get in, fire the cannons, and get out before the tracers find you. It is a game measured in milliseconds, and the tail gunner holds the keys to the clock." Lorenz pressed his attack. He came in low and fast, his heart rate spiking as he approached the zone of maximum lethality, the last 300 yards. Hansen saw the flash. He didn't wait for the tracer rounds to confirm the Messerschmitt's trajectory. He gripped the spade grips, his knuckles white, and pressed the triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life, a vibrating symphony of destruction, spitting fire and smoke into the thin air. The noise was so immense it seemed to push the cold air back. He laid a stream of tracers directly into the path of the oncoming Bf-109. He didn't see the hit, but the instantaneous result was unmistakable. A violent sheet of flame erupted from the German fighter's engine cowling. It pitched violently to the right, a column of smoke following it, spiraling down, becoming one more geometric line on the immense chaotic canvas of the sky. A voice, crackling with static, came over the intercom. "One down! Good shooting, Tail!" Hansen did not respond. His ears were ringing, his eyes stinging, and he felt a profound, chilling detachment. He had just ended a life, but in this violent altitude, it was only a technical victory, one more threat neutralized. He immediately traversed his guns to the next threat, a pair of FW-190s coming hard from the high side, hungry for revenge. The fight was far from over. The B-17 had survived the initial iron test, but the cost was already mounting. Every minute the formation stayed in the kill zone meant more flak, more attacks, and more strain on the isolated, courageous men guarding the rear. The true enemy of the tail gunner was not just the fighter plane, but the profound, paralyzing isolation. The tail compartment was the loneliest place in the sky. Communication was filtered through the unreliable, static-ridden intercom, often drowned out by the noise of the engines and the cacophony of incoming fire. For minutes that stretched into an eternity, the tail gunner was the last line of defense, with only the sight of the receding bomber formation for company. Sergeant Hansen, sweat freezing on his brow, felt that isolation acutely. After downing the first fighter, a new wave arrived, focusing with brutal efficiency on the bomber immediately ahead of him, the Lady Luck. The German pilots had adopted a new, sickeningly effective tactic, the company front. They flew three abreast, converging their fire on a single target, ensuring maximum saturation. The gunners inside the Lady Luck fought back desperately. Tracers flew in arcs, red and yellow lines crossing like malevolent knitting needles. But the coordinated German attack was too heavy. A catastrophic volley of $20 shells struck the bomber's innermost engine, instantly turning it into a churning bonfire. Moments later, a second volley pulverized the horizontal stabilizer. Hansen watched in horror as the rear half of the Lady Luck simply buckled. The tail section, the great ruddered cross that controlled the aircraft's stability, separated from the main fuselage. It didn't explode. It simply tore away, a massive, unrecognizable piece of twisted metal. And inside that falling tail cone was another boy, another tail gunner, suspended thousands of feet above the earth, doomed. The sight of the detached tail section, with the gunner still strapped inside, plunging silently towards the land below, had a devastating psychological effect on the American bomber crews. It was a macabre, impossible image that defied all military rationale. This was not a quick explosion. It was an extended, silent descent into oblivion. For Major Stahl and the other German pilots, the sight was equally shocking, but for a different reason. They had intended to cripple the bomber, not rip the back off it. The sheer destructive power of their coordinated cannon fire was a terrible revelation, but it also carried an omen. They were not just shooting at machines, they were dismantling the very geometry of the enemy. The event, which would become known simply as the day the tail fell, had an immediate and unexpected consequence for both sides. For the American airmen, it reinforced the desperate need for tight formation flying. The only sanctuary was within the fire net of the other B-17s. An isolated bomber was a dead bomber. It also, paradoxically, strengthened the resolve of the gunners. Seeing the tail fall, "It wasn't fear I felt," recalled Sergeant George R. Miller, a ball turret gunner who witnessed the event. "It was a cold, pure anger. That kid died alone. I swore then and there that if they came for me, they'd pay for every single inch of that fall." For the German pilots, the shock was strategic. They saw the American formation, despite the catastrophic loss, holding its cohesion. The Lady Luck, though mortally wounded, did not immediately explode. The crew jettisoned the bomb load and struggled on for a few more agonizing minutes before the rest of the crew bailed out. The machine, even in death, was stubbornly resistant. Crucially, the attack that tore away the tail exposed the fundamental truth of the B-17's design. It was engineered to absorb phenomenal damage. The structural redundancy and the placement of critical systems meant that only a devastating, coordinated strike could bring it down immediately. A single fighter, no matter how skilled, rarely achieved a clean kill. The tail gunner was the key, admitted a captured German pilot years later. The Americans put a gunner in a vulnerable spot, yes, but by God they made that spot virtually invincible if the man inside was determined. The fear wasn't the gun. It was the inevitability of the other gunner shooting you down when you went for the first one. The loss of the Lady Luck was a tragedy, but it served as a brutal, visceral advertisement for the B-17's surprising resilience and an indirect, chilling tribute to the lone sentry, who, even in his final moments, had drawn the attack away from the men ahead of him. The battle of attrition was now fully underway, and the human cost was rising by the second. Following the disastrous loss of the bomber formation's cohesion over Schweinfurt, the German pilots believed they had cracked the code of the flying fortress. They had demonstrated that concentrated cannon fire could literally dismember the B-17. The Luftwaffe strategy doubled down on the company front attack, focusing overwhelmingly on the vulnerable tail section, convinced that the psychological and material damage would force the Americans to abandon daylight raids. This was Major Stahl's great strategic miscalculation. The American response was not to retreat, but to adapt with ruthless efficiency. The war was turning into a brutal doctrine of attrition, a test of industrial might and human endurance. The engineers swiftly implemented field modifications to enhance the tail gunners' protection. They began adding more armor plate, small critical sheets of steel surrounding the gunner's station, specifically targeting the areas exposed during the high-speed 6 o'clock low attack. Furthermore, the focus of the gunnery training shifted. It was no longer about precision marksmanship, but about generating maximum volume of fire, putting out so many $0, $50 caliber rounds that the enemy simply could not penetrate the hail of hot metal. "We didn't need sharpshooters. We needed fire hoses," stated General Curtis LeMay, who was pushing the bomber doctrine with iron will. "The goal is to make the enemy pilot blink. If he blinks for 1 second, he flies into the path of 1,000 rounds." The numbers quickly told the story of this industrial war. By early 1944, American factories were churning out B-17s at a rate that stunned the centralized, though highly advanced, German industry. For every 5 American bombers shot down, 10 were rolling off the production line. More importantly, the replacement rate for American aircrews, though harrowing, was sustainable. The replacement rate for veteran German fighter pilots, those crucial masters of air combat, was not. The tail gunner became the epicenter of this war of numbers. Every German fighter pilot shot down was a massive, irreplaceable loss to the Luftwaffe. Every American gunner who survived his tour of 25 missions returned home, carrying with him the lethal knowledge and experience necessary to train the next generation. Major Erich Stahl, growing visibly weary and frustrated in his diary entries of early 1944, noted the terrifying shift in American gunnery. "The Americans, they are not retreating, they are hardening. The attacks now are more costly. The tail gunners, they are no longer novice shooters. They fire without hesitation, without the fear we once saw. Their fire is thick, a blanket of burning metal. We lose excellent men, masters of the fight, to these boys who sit silent in the rear. The Festung is becoming too costly to approach from any angle." This change in perception, from contempt to fear, was the turning point. The German pilots began to recognize the specific B-17s that had survived multiple raids. They saw the battle damage patches, the worn paint, the personalized nose art, and they knew the men inside were veterans, hardened and terrifyingly efficient. In one iconic engagement over Berlin in March 1944, Sergeant Hansen, now a veteran of 15 missions, found himself once again facing a determined head-on and tail-out attack. This time, he didn't panic. His actions were purely muscle memory, honed by terror and experience. He spotted the incoming FW-190, its pilot executing a perfect low pass to evade the ball turret. Hansen didn't hose the sky. He waited until the perfect moment, timing his burst to the fighter's anticipated escape route. When he fired, the stream was short, focused, and devastating. The rounds tore through the wing root of the FW-190, striking the main spar and the pilot's cabin. The plane was instantly reduced to spinning wreckage. The effect of these successful kills was cumulative and psychological. The Luftwaffe, already strained by the Eastern Front and the lack of fuel, began to suffer from a lack of confidence. The flying fortress was no longer a slow target. It was a porcupine, and every quill was a lethal threat. The fear of the B-17 tail gunner was now a codified operational reality, a psychological burden that made the German pilots hesitate for those critical milliseconds, the hesitation that cost them their lives. By late 1944, the strategic landscape of the air war was irreversible. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with its formidable range, finally provided the B-17s with the necessary long-range escort, effectively closing the strategic window the Luftwaffe had previously exploited. But the victory over the skies of Europe was not solely due to the P-51. It was secured fundamentally by the men who had held the line during the unescorted months, the tail gunners. The legacy of the tail gunner is one of defiance through isolation. They were the ultimate exemplars of the strategic sacrifice of the 8th Air Force. The numbers, though cold, tell the story. The 8th Air Force suffered a staggering 26,000 casualties, more than the entire US. Marine Corps suffered in the war. The tail gunners, by necessity, bore a disproportionate amount of that risk. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The B-17, the initially underestimated behemoth, proved to be the industrial and psychological wrecking ball of the daylight bombing campaign. It forced the Luftwaffe to expend irreplaceable resources, pilots, fuel, and time in a grueling, unwinnable war of attrition. The B-17 formation fire net, with the tail gunner as its cornerstone, ensured that the bombing campaign, despite its immense losses, could continue, uninterrupted, day after grinding day. Consider the final statistics. The Luftwaffe lost over 10,000 pilots in the defense of the Reich, a crippling, unrecoverable drain on their experienced manpower. Many of those losses were directly attributed to the defensive fire of the bomber crews, often falling in the treacherous rear quadrant. Sergeant Hansen survived his tour. He returned home, haunted by the images of the flak, the exploding fighters, and the silent, terrifying descent of the Lady Luck's tail. His story, and the stories of thousands like him, highlight the central theme of the air war, the ultimate triumph of technology applied with strategic mass and fortified by human endurance. The B-17 was designed to take a hit and keep flying. The tail gunner was trained to shoot and keep firing. The combination created an unstoppable force. The early German laughter faded into the desperate realization that they were fighting not just a machine, but a factory. And the isolated, cold boy at the rear of that factory was the most dangerous cog of all. The fear Major Stoll and his peers developed for the B-17's tail gunner was a hard-earned respect. It was the fear of seeing an enemy who was supposed to break, instead hold the line, fire after fire, day after day. It was the fear of the last solitary sentry, watching their approach from the loneliest corner of the sky, ready to deliver the final, lethal verdict. The war ended not just in the trenches, but in the skies, secured by the steady aim of the men who saw the enemy coming first. The legacy of the tail end Charlie is simple. They were the last to see the threat and the first to neutralize it. They were the lonely ultimate proof that the flying fortress was indeed a fortress, and their fury became the wind that swept the Luftwaffe from the skies. If this deep dive into the strategic mind games and incredible courage of the B-17 gunners captivated you, let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical breakdowns of World War II's most crucial battles and technologies. Your support helps us tell these vital stories.